Cities embody society's conceptual, cultural, and intellectual enterprise. Through the instrumentality of its built fabric, the city expresses an implied projection of formal and structural determinants, but is, as well, a register of cultural, religious, and ideological stimuli. Urban architecture is both a critical appraisal and cognitive reflection of these values. Urban processes are the primary mechanism for transmission of patterns of social and political plurality. The research is explored through the discourse of urban emulation and restatement in urban form, as a trope for generative urbanism in colonial cities and their legacy in catalyzing resilient urban structures and nodal suburbs. It is arguably a planning instrument in itself, and underpinned by an archetypal encyclopedic urbanism. The research invokes historical, canonical, and contemporary precedent, as well as design speculation, forming an architectural and urban analysis of the role of social critique and aspirations as catalysts for the design of cities, and simultaneously the manner in which cities and their architecture have been an ideological armature and apparatus for social change and urban resilience.
Early settler Australia, perimeter urbanism. There were no walled towns in settler Australia. There may have been in North America, but not in Australia. There, Britain had no major land-based power rival, though France had expressed some naval interest, and the First Nations population was devastated by murder and disease within several years of each settlement being proclaimed. Naval fortresses, either round Sydney's harbour or 57 kilometres distant at the mouth of Melbourne's Bay, were the new protection, and with that, the settlers' city wall became a vestige. In the colonial capitals, this vestige was now like a wall perimeter, a wall-like perimeter in one or two flanking streets. Macquarie and Sussex Street framed Sydney on its east and west, 1788. Macquarie and Davies Streets framed Hobart's south front from 1804. Queen William and Roma Streets defined early Brisbane's southwest from 1825, as did St George's Terrace along central Perth's west in 1829. Spring and Flinders Streets defined early Melbourne's east and south sides, 1835 to 1837, as did North Terrace in Adelaide, 1836. All these streets arranged the major colonial institutions in rows, usually the governor's houses, colonial treasuries, the customs houses, hospitals, major churches, university and school buildings, law courts. Later on came the principal railway stations, some of the military barracks, and later exposition buildings and major sports arenas, arrayed in one or two lines around the military's grid plan of each town. The nearest American counterpart to this perimeter urbanism is arguably Chicago, 1833 to 1837, which, having demolished its earlier fort, soon built a visually similar concentration of major institutional buildings along Michigan Avenue. In Australia, all these streets and their building concentrations were symbolically and politically charged and worked to re-establish an absent metropolis, while at the same time criticising it. Perimeter urbanism did this by emulating the forms and details of crucial British and European buildings, and then, as money allowed, sought to consciously improve on or provide an alternative to perceived old world originals. This process favoured visual impressions over detailed method or checklisting. This paralleled the general Australian tendency in building to affirm the detached house as an alternative to tenements or apartment housing, and increasingly in opposition to terraced or row housing. In Australian colonial capitals, these lines of institutional buildings invariably fronted parkland and some water, which made those new boundaries moments of intense expression in transition from city fabric to open country, and a direct projection of colonial society and polity against a generally manicured wilderness. The perimeter urbanism often used didactic components. Howard Tanner observed that the wilderness encounter with Sydney Domain and the open land to early Sydney's east was a consequence of being consigned to the convict barracks in Macquarie Street, from where you may have been sent from the Supreme Court, sited just behind that. On the way, you could pray at St James's Church, directly opposite the barracks. This diagram of social consequences formed part, a thickening, of the Australian early settler cities' substitute wall.
Urban emulation, early settler period. Urban emulation as a perceived necessity is apparent from Francis Greenway's proclaiming himself as an authentic metropolitan voice, in a bid to control government buildings in Sydney's Macquarie Street, 1814. He doubtless envisaged whole precincts matching or aspiring to London regions, though he only achieved this in his didactic cluster of Macquarie Street buildings, Hyde Park Barracks, St James's Church, and the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was originally house-like, but the church and the barracks were decidedly institutional, as British urban buildings had been. St James resembled a series of large London and British Empire churches from the 17th to early 19th centuries. The barracks recalled Wren's Pembroke College at Cambridge, 1665. Greenway claimed a true understanding of architectural principles, as opposed to the primitivism and misunderstanding he saw in local buildings when he was forcibly shipped to Australia for bouncing a cheque in 1814. By 1850, Australian colonial towns had gained some metropolitan sense, mostly through individual but related buildings, using army and naval barrack form, some ancient Greek or Roman detail, and Renaissance rustication and story layering. By then, Joseph Fowles, Sydney in 1848, was proclaiming Sydney as the equal in many buildings to London and other major British cities, and notable British buildings continued as a source of distinct emulation to the 19th and 20th century. Fowles was optimistic in his 1840s assessment, but by 1850s, Australia had quite a few serious rivals in sophistication to new and leading British buildings. This not wholly surprising. By 1855, Australian architects included those who had worked for John Nash, Charles Barry, Augustus Pugin, Philip Hardwick, and William Dyce, and both Pugin and Edward Bloor had designed colonial buildings by invitation. The detail and veracity of these designs and the pervasive influence of pattern books in other Australian buildings could beat the looming fact of several thousand kilometres of distance and opposite seasons.
Urban emulation, mid-19th century. Distinct and more complex emulation came with enlarged colonial legislatures. Melbourne's 1856 to 91 and Adelaide's 1874 to 89 and 1939 took Cuthbert Broderick's Leeds Town Hall in Yorkshire 1853 to 58 and made it Doric as a distinct source, citing a city of recognisable industry and hard work, just as good as the gentry and an example to us all. These elements were crucial to the collective images that now drive Australian urban form. It was not by any means the centrality of or commitment to styles. There were few architects committed to one particular style in Australian cities anyway, but not for the reason complained of by modernists, that is, that they had no real conviction because, evaluated constantly later on in terms of style, they seemed to depart from stylistic allegiance in competition designs or alternative plans. The Pergamon altar colonnade of Broderick's Leeds Town Hall recurred in two major municipal halls, Launceston, 1864-67, and Charles Webb's at South Melbourne, 1879-1880. British emulation of Jacopo Sansovino's Venetian palaces, as in Gilbert Scott's Foreign Office, 1865, was arguably challenged by an upsurge of Jacopo Sansovino emulations in Melbourne during the 1850s, extending on right through into the 1880s. From circa 1844, Roman palazzi by the younger Sangallo, Raphael and Michelangelo gained rapid emulation in Australia's colonial capitals, where banks, clubs and other buildings sought commercial probity and continued right through to Walter Baggett's Elders Rural Finances offices in Adelaide, 1937-1940. What is of equal interest, though, is what these expanding cities and towns omitted or avoided. Early Florentine Renaissance, though widespread in other ex-colonial cultures, as in the US, is not nearly so evident in Australian capitals, though Roy Grounds used it much later as one source for his neo-liberty framed National Gallery of Victoria, 1959-1968. The closely connected German Rundbogenstil is rare also, other than in early designs for Bendigo Hospital by Germans, Wilhelm Fahland and Robert Getchman, 1860 and following, and again in a much later design, the south side to Melbourne State Library and Museum, 1932, by Leighton Irwin and Roy Stevenson.
Impressionist urbanism, mid to late 19th century. To ignore urbanism is to ignore much of the 19th century's contribution to urbanism, and in Australia it is to ignore contributions by urban emulation, extending the initial impetus brought by perimeter urbanism. After the 1820s, the grouped buildings, forms and symbolism of the colonial capitals began to move inward, into the more everyday buildings of the invariably gridded streets, behind the initial perimeter wall. Post offices and town halls were the first to move in from the perimeter, Hobart and Perth excepted. These buildings tended to remain fairly close, a block basically from each other, as in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane and Adelaide. They were also accompanied by the senior law courts, first in Sydney, then in Melbourne and Adelaide. Hobart and Perth were again the standouts, keeping theirs at the perimeter. So did Brisbane, grouping its around Roma Strait at the west end of the early colonial wall. With limited colonial resources, Australia began to work these urban forms in ensemble groupings, creating precincts with linked visual qualities. It did not always work. The competing fronts and the scales in Melbourne's Collins Street and Adelaide's King and William Street bear this out. But a series of successful precincts still emerged: Melbourne's Rialto and Theatre and Paris precincts, Adelaide's Victoria Square grouping, Sydney's Mid-Pitt Street with its Venetian Gothic, Hobart with its Macquarie, Davey and Elizabeth Streets. Melbourne's Rialto and Paris precincts show how this worked in detail, and how their presence evolved and faced being obscured. The styles and details in each precinct were not the same. Melbourne's Rialto precinct, for example, had 3 identifiably Venetian fronts out of its 6, plus its 4 outliers in the Gothic Bank area, and 3 more in Western Bourke Street to the precinct's north. 2 other buildings in this group used a broad Hellenistic facade using later Greek classicism, and a third used a freestyle front mixing 19th century American Romanesque with elements of Norman Shaw's London freestyle. This was logical. All were the efforts of varied developers and personalities, but the point was in the scale and the grain rather than the historical specifics. All implied Venetian pier-based construction. All were quite skeletal in their glass-to-structure ratio. All departed from established palazzo form in reasserting pitch roofs, set transverse along their streets. Almost all used exposed or minimized wall areas. As in the early boundary urbanism, the Australian colonial capitals intended critique. By visible involvement on European or British sources, the improvement now tended to come in more intensely figured surface grain and in more extensive groupings of buildings, with the central city areas devolving into varied precincts. Melbourne's Rialto precinct, as it became known, was one. So was its theatre district, taking on the eccentric mantle of theatre architecture in a London manner, with some involvement from Paris. So too with Melbourne's former Paris End, where plane trees encouraged a collective urbanism in 5 or 6-story buildings that lasted till their scale was broken in the 1960s. Some were more articulate and consistent visually than others, but the tendency was clearly there and could be said to mark a mid-late 19th century urbanism.
Nodal Suburbs and Australian National Federation. The years around Australia's federation, at least as a British Empire dominion, saw a broad realignment of architects around freestyle architecture, then developing in Britain, Europe, and the United States. As with earlier design, this shift in Australian architecture has largely been discussed as a style change and as primarily domestic in scope. Outside of stylistic influences, its specific physical and political context has received less attention. Outside the city beautiful and garden city movements, both limited in area and scope, Australia's big change was in developing commuter suburbs using trams and especially trains. The density of Australian cities collapsed as their walk-to-work dimension and their veranda terrace housing and narrow workers' cottages were replaced, allowing large sites and stimulating spreading house forms. The result was not, however, a slump into undifferentiated urban sprawl as is widely maintained in Australia. Architectural expression moved closer to the expressive, asymmetrical freestyles ascended in British and American houses. Like them, Australian architects sought distinctively national expression in extending verandas to homestead proportions, by experiments with internal planning and significant changes to interior decor. This national sentiment led to a weakening of the colonial city's traditional place in Australian society. The crucial urban arena was now becoming the functionings of a new national capital, agreed on with Australian Federation in 1901 and placed in Canberra in 1912's design competition. In the 19th century, colonial cities, as the crux of settler society's place identity, were dominant. Suburban shops and government had lined arterial roads almost in tribute, expressing both opulence yet subordination to the central colonial CBDs. Now, groups of suburbs began to form distinct commercial and administrative areas, serving circles of 4 or 5 tributary suburbs and looking visibly different from surrounding suburban scale, services and density. Issues transcending suburban administration and affairs became increasingly focused on the federal government, and this was reflected in suburban form and the reshaping of suburban centres. Some of these nodal suburbs formed along roads running at right angles to the principal arteries. Some formed distinct CBDs in smallish grids, reimagining the central cities in miniature or at a lower scale. Some suburban nodes were twins in adjacent suburbs. Railways, following their own routes and shaped by contours and terrain, pulled most of them away from the road arteries, which immediately freed up their spread and form. Much the same happened in Los Angeles, growing from several nodes, including by 1920 Pasadena, Beverly Hills, Hollywood, Long Beach, Anaheim, and Santa Monica. This urban affinity may partly explain suburban place naming in Australia, Bel Air, Pasadena in Adelaide, for example, and ultimately the prevailing bungalow form marking Australian suburbs in the early 20th century. Similar nodes developed in London's middle and outer suburbs, Stratford, Richmond, Kingston, Croydon. Melbourne and Sydney each gained around 10 to 14 such nodes. Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth gained 4 or 5 each, and Hobart 2.
Again, Australia's nodal suburbs are largely the collective transposition of cohesive visual imagery, understood at a general level and enacted with the agreement of groups of individuals in business and administration. That gives them a degree of conservatism and vested interest, which has also been a major element in urban emulation's persistence in Australia. Nodal suburbs once more read as collectives or sections of city fabric. That marks all three general phases of this pattern as seen in the urbanism of Australian settler society. The approaches stemming from urban emulation have imposing resilience. Boundary urbanism of 1788 to 1840 remains conspicuous in each of the Australian capital cities outside Canberra. Urban emulation of 1840 to 1890 still shapes CBD precincts and Canberra, which itself defied boundary urbanism and relied in its monumental design on the clarified imagery of Parrish and Washington boulevards, ordering and forming a skeleton on which the griffins hung the capillary and soft tissue of its swirling side streets. In the former colonial capitals, now the state capitals, railway-generated nodes came under challenge from car and bus-based shopping malls after 1960. These were set away from the railway nodes and placed in direct commercial competition with them. But the earlier railway nodes continued to offer services, variation and atmosphere beyond the standardized and formulaic imagery of the malls, and have almost all survived as nodes despite mall competition. Besides the earlier railway nodes, form mostly allowed high-rise, which was often difficult in mall settings. Apart from a few mall clusters, Doncaster in Melbourne, Bondi Junction in Sydney, the older railway nodes have developed even greater CBD resemblances, drawing on high-rise as a generalized source of urban emulation. In Australia, high-rise outside capital city centres emerged in the 1960s as long lines of medium-rise with Miami Beach, Waikiki, Copacabana imagery. This was applied first in resort cities such as Coolangatta and beachside areas such as South Melbourne. Now it extends in more rounded high-rise clusters to long-established railway-generated nodes like Box Hill, South Yarra, Footscray, and Moonee Ponds in Melbourne, Hurstville, Kogarah, Parramatta, Strathfield and Burwood, Chatswood, and Bondi Junction in Sydney. In this process, the imagery in Australian suburban nodes seems to be drifting from Pasadena and Croydon towards the similarly tarred railway nodes in an arc around central Tokyo, Ikebukuro, Shinjuku, and Shibuya. That is hardly surprising. Neither Melbourne nor Sydney are remotely Tokyo's population, but each now has around 5.8 million people,